I'm just going to get started. Hello, my name is Rochelle Atala, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to Lighthouse Books this evening to celebrate the launch of my good friend Victoria Mackenzie's debut novel, if you can believe it, called For Thy Great Pain, Have Mercy on My Little Pain. Please join me in giving her a round of applause. Clapping against the mic. Before we get started, I'm just going to run through the kind of format of the evening. We're going to have a nice chat, and there's going to be some readings for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. I know we have some people streaming as well, so if there's any questions from people online, that's great too. And I'm just going to go ahead and get started and introduce you properly. So, Victoria is a fiction writer and poet based in Fife. She is the winner of the Scottish Book Trust and Writers Award and an inaugural Emerging Writer Award from Monarch Moore. She was shortlisted for the Lucy Cavendish Fiction Prize, as well as being awarded prestigious writing residencies in Scotland, Finland, and Australia. Her short stories have been published widely in literary anthologies, and she also teaches creative writing. For Thy Great Pain, Have Mercy on My Little Pain is her debut novel, and it is already receiving wide critical acclaim. The Guardian, I think it was Guardian's Book of the Week, they called it Electrifying, a pocket epic. It's also the editor's pick for Marie Claire, and they called it stunningly original. And if that was not enough, Roddy Doyle, of all people, says it's the best first book he has read in years. I think that deserves another round of applause. So welcome. Before I ask you to do your first reading, would it be okay if you kind of, in your own words, very briefly described your book for us, for those that don't know anything about it?
Yes, of course. Into my mic working. Yes. Okay, great. So, For Thy Great Pain is based on the lives of two real women, Marjorie Kemp and Julian of Norwich, who lived in Norfolk in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. They both claim to have visions of Christ, but what interested me about them is how different their lives were, how different their personalities were. Initially, I thought of writing a novel about Julian because she was an anchoress, which, for those of you not familiar with the anchoress lifestyle, it's the female form of anchorite, and it's someone who chooses to live in a single room for the rest of their life, devoting their time to contemplation and prayer. And I was fascinated by the extremity of this lifestyle choice. But once I started researching Julian, I came across the figure of Marjorie Kemp quite quickly, who, as I say, also had these visions of Christ, and who went to visit Julian in her anchoress cell to ask for advice about these visions. Marjorie is very different from an anchoress. She was a mother of 14. She travelled widely in Europe as a pilgrim. She was a merchant's wife, and she was someone who was very loud and boastful, very much in the world. And as a novelist, it just seemed fascinating to me to imagine what these two women had to say to each other. We know that they met because Marjorie dictated her life story in the Book of Marjorie Kemp, and she mentions going to visit Julian in Norwich in her anchoress cell. But all she says about it is that she received wise counsel from Julian. So as a writer, it seemed incredibly exciting to imagine this conversation. And I decided that was what I wanted to build my novel around. And I've structured the novel in terms of two interweaving monologues. So it alternates between Marjorie's voice telling her life story and Julian's voice telling her life story, and then culminates in this meeting between them.
And are you happy to give us a reading?
Absolutely, yes. I'm going to read from the beginning, just for about 5 minutes. And I'm going to read, first of all, it's Julian's voice, and then I'll go on to Marjorie's. Well, I guess I should say as well, perhaps, that they lived in Norfolk during successive waves of the plague, and it was really important to me to make this part of Julian's life in particular. Julian. When I was a child of 7 summers, a great pestilence came to our city. As the death carts went up and down the streets, the sound of their wheels and the horses' hooves mingled with the sounds of weeping. But there was little time for ceremony. Thump. The bodies were wrapped in whatever was to hand, sheets, tablecloths, rugs, and heaved onto the cart. I watched from an upstairs window, something both my mother and my nurse Joan had told me not to do. Thump. The cart trundled to the next house. Thump. Sometimes a covering came loose as a body hit the wooden planks, unravelling to reveal a chin or an ear. We were rich, this had always been clear to me. We ate well and our house had many rooms. My clothes were made from Flanders linen, and my mother had a garden just for flowers, just for beauty. Imagine. But still we died. The pestilence travelled through the air like the fog from the river that curled its way under our door in autumn. My father died, and my nurse Jane died, and my older brother William died. Then my younger sister Elizabeth died, whom I had always called Betty. Thump. Her sweet plump body was thrown away. The city stank of rotting flesh. I was not allowed to play outside. There were no merchants, no boats, and no markets that year. No crops were planted, and no animals were herded through the city gates for slaughter. Even the bells fell silent. Afterwards, my mother and I lived together in a more sombre way. She withdrew into sadness, rarely raising her eyes to me. I learnt to keep my own company, wandering through the empty rooms of the now too big house, tiptoeing so I didn't disturb her. The flowers in her garden still bloomed, but my mother no longer tended them. Marjorie. Christ first visited me some months after the birth of my eldest child, when I laboured for more hours than a single day can hold. I suffered much when I was with child, with vomiting and aches, and I was afraid it was punishment for my sins. I also desired to eat strange things, clods of mud and leather soles from boots. My husband wasn't pleased and told me not to eat these things. He said that if I didn't stop, he would have me imprisoned in my chamber and he would put shackles on my arms. At that, I quite lost my reason. I ranted and screamed and tore at my clothes and hair. And I was indeed restrained as my husband had threatened, and he took away my keys. Then my labour pains began, and they were shackles themselves, pinning me down and causing me to roar. My neighbour, Agnes, was at my side to aid me through the birth, but she tutted at my cries and spent more time gossiping outside my room than rubbing my belly with rose oil. When the child emerged, I thought he was the devil come to split me in two and toss my entrails to the dogs. I prayed to St. Margaret to relieve me of the terror and let me die quickly, but she did not hear my pleas. When Agnes pulled the devil from between my damp thighs, he brought other demons who poured at me and hauled me about the bed all night and day. I named the baby John after his father, and Agnes cut the cord and swaddled him. The child was baptized at church 2 days later, but I could not leave my bed. The demons told me to forsake my faith and my husband and my friends, which I did, slandering them and recognizing no goodness in them. They also told me to hurt myself, and I scratched at my arms and made them bleed, and I bit my own hand very hard. Agnes put honey on the wound and bound it, but the mark has stayed ever since. I believed I was dying, and because of this I asked to see my confessor, so I could tell him of a sin that had long been on my mind. I had never confessed it before, because every time I thought to, something would whisper in my ear that if I repented in my mind and made penance, that was enough. I often did penance by fasting on bread and water and spending many hours at prayer. But now, when I thought I would die, I knew I must confess and be rid of the sin, or I could never lift my face to the Lord and receive him. My confessor came to my room, and I said I wanted to be shriven of the sins of my whole life. So I began with the first sins of my childhood, including envy of my brother, up to the particular sin that was bothering me. But as I began to tell of this sin, my confessor was sharp with me, telling me not to take all day, and then I could not get the sin out. This made me frenzied, and I hurt myself more. It was after this that Jesus Christ appeared, sitting on the edge of my bed, very handsome and clad in a mantle of purple silk. He looks at me with so blessed a countenance that I felt my spirit strengthen.
I mean, what an opening to both characters. You know, just talk about immersing the reader in a character immediately. I know you touched on this in your kind of brief introduction about the fact that you became quite interested in anchorets. But because these women are real, they exist, what was the initial seed of the inspiration to come and kind of portray these two women?
So I guess one of the most important aspects of them is that they both wrote about their visions. Julian of Norwich wrote a theological text about these visions that she had. She was around 30 and she had 16 visions or showings, as she calls them, of God and Jesus, just over a few days when she was very sick. She probably wrote about them quite quickly in a text known as the short text, but then she became an anchoress, spent much longer reflecting on them and wrote what's known as the long text. And it's these two together that form Revelations of Divine Love. And this book's so important because it's the first known book in English by a woman. So it's absolutely a pivotal part of the canon of women's writing. Marjorie was probably illiterate, but she dictated her life story to a number of scribes towards the end of her life, probably in her 60s. And it's known as the Book of Marjorie Kemp. And this is also a hugely significant book because it's the first autobiography in English, whether by a man or a woman, that we have that's known. So I feel that, you know, these women, they deserve to be so much better known. They are studied by medieval scholars and so on, but they're not household names. So it was sort of interesting to write about them, thinking that perhaps, you know, by writing a novel, it might introduce people to them who wouldn't otherwise come across them. But I think really the sort of initial impulse was this anchoress lifestyle of Julian. I've always been really obsessed with nuns. And initially I had thought that Julian was a nun. It turns out we don't know if she was a nun or not. You could go from being a layperson straight into being an anchoress. And they weren't actually nuns themselves. But like a nun, you would go into church and you would take these vows. I say in the novel that as a nun, you take this sort of marriage vow, you marry Christ. But as an anchoress, it's much more like a funeral. There's a kind of there's a requiem, and you die to the world, and you give up your name, and you give up your life just to live in this one room, and you can't leave it on pain of excommunication. Which clearly, if you're Catholic, is the eternal damnation of your soul. You're not going to leave this room lightly. There are different sort of levels of extremeness with anchoresses. So some could actually leave their cell to wander in the sort of church grounds, but others were actually bricked into their room and couldn't leave at all. And because I was interested in this extremity, I decided to kind of go full throttle with Julian and to make her one of the bricked in ones, because that was what interested me so much. I wanted to imagine what it would do to you, basically, to live in a single room. What it would do to your understanding of the world. I was thinking about how much these sort of sensory experiences would be important to her, thinking about what she could hear from her cell, what she could see, very limited because of such a constrained life. I wanted to think about the physicality of the cell, because I think often with mystics, we sort of imagine that they're just these incredibly spiritual people. But I really wanted to collide that with the fact that she has a body. She's a woman. And I wanted to, kind of collide those two things and have her really struggle to live in a cell and to still be this kind of earthly being. You know, so she has a maid who has to bring her food and take away her slops. You know, she's still eating and defecating. She hasn't become pure soul. She still has a body. So for me as a novelist, I just really got into imagining this, and I really got into imagining the kind of the earth, earth on the floor, the earwigs that might come in, just this kind of like very physical experience of being anchoress, and how it might take time for you to adjust to living in one room before you could kind of feel at peace with that life. I didn't want to make it something that was just easy for her, because I didn't think that would be realistic.
And I think that comes across in the book. You know, you get that sense, particularly in the moment when she walks into the cell and start to brick it up. Because before she walked in, I'm reading it, and you know, the clues in me, it's thinking, you know, it might not be the worst thing in the world, you know, to be able to just sit in your cell and you don't have to kind of perform your normal duties as such. And then when she does walk in and they start to brick her up, I, as a reader, just thought, oh my goodness, like you just want to immediately run, you know, run as fast as you could. So I think that comes across beautifully in the book, and especially those really difficult first days for her. But then obviously we have Marjorie as well, who's a very different kind of kettle of fish, so to speak. How did you kind of embody her voice to get her down on page the way she is?
So with Marjorie, the book of Marjorie Kemp is a bit problematic in as much as she was probably illiterate, she dictated it, so she probably had no way of checking that what was written down was her words. So you have to kind of bear that in mind. But I think despite that, a really strong sense of character for me as a writer came through from the book of Marjorie Kemp. The storytelling is quite unstructured and chaotic. It's very different from Julian's book, which is very calm and contemplative. Julian hardly brings any of her life into her story, whereas Marjorie's book is all about Marjorie. And it's glorious because we have very little record of what it was like to be an ordinary woman at this time, her sort of day-to-day life. And she talks about the fact she's got 14 children and how she struggles with that. She talks about her relations with her neighbours. She talks about how she works as an alewife to try to bring in extra money, and how the ale goes bad and her neighbours say it's because God doesn't like her. It's full of these wonderful, ordinary details that we just don't have that many examples of in this period. So it's a really glorious source for thinking about what ordinary life was like in the medieval period. As a writer, I had absolute carte blanche for Julia to create the life for her, because we know almost nothing about her. Even her name, Julian of Norwich, is just taken from the church where she had her anchoress cell. We don't even know her real name. So I invented a whole life for Julia. But with Marjorie, some people feel that Marjorie might have been easier to write, but actually she was more difficult, because I was working within the constraints of the book of Marjorie Kemp and trying, even though it's a novel, I didn't want to bring in things that contradicted the texts or that couldn't have been true. So I've tried to work within what was plausible for Marjorie. But it was great to work with her voice, because it just comes singing off the page in the book of Marjorie Kemp. She's very boastful. She'll talk to anybody who'll listen, even if they don't want to listen, about her visions. And she's incredibly brave, because to have to say that you had these direct visions of God or Christ at this time was heretical. So, and the kind of the punishment for heresy at this time was to be burnt at the stake. And Marjorie knew this all too well. A priest of hers, when she was younger, was taken to London and burnt at the stake for heresy. She's incredibly brave, and she's arrested repeatedly for heresy. And there's a kind of desperation there as well. People do question the authenticity of her experiences. She's not been taken as seriously as a theologian as Julian. But I found her voice particularly engaging, because despite all this boastfulness and this sort of tenacious determination to talk about her visions, to me there was this vulnerability there as well between the lines. And so I really wanted to draw that out of Marjorie and to make her seem, she's fun, she's boastful, but I really want to create that sense of desperation and loneliness there as well, which I feel is in her book. So it was fantastic source material to work with.
So you would say it was more liberating than writing Julian's, because you had a blank page.
Yeah, and exactly. And there were things, in her book that suggest that she may have been a mother. So I've invented a domestic family life for her in the past. but also she, I feel like she had these visions when she was 30, and then she takes a while to become an anchoress. And I was thinking, why do you become an anchoress? What is it that's driving her to take this decision? And I was imagining that perhaps she felt these visions were important and she wanted the time and the space to reflect on them. And as a medieval woman, how do you go about getting time and space for yourself? And most women were either in the sort of thrust of domestic life, they were working, or perhaps they might become a nun. So I thought, okay, perhaps she could have become a nun, but she didn't. She became an anchoress. And I was thinking, well, nuns probably have quite a busy life as well. They have these routines, and they're often doing work in the community. They're often running almost like a farm estate, they're sort of food growing and so on. And so I thought, perhaps in this really paradoxical way, becoming an anchoress was a way that a woman could get freedom, because it's a physical constraint, but she has the freedom to think and to read if someone brings her the materials, and to write. And I suppose it was sort of like a glorified writer's retreat. But I thought that this was really interesting to me, this paradoxical idea that perhaps an anchoress is a way a woman had freedom in the medieval period.
And obviously, thinking about the two characters and the way the book sets out, they are very, for example, Julian thinks about the child and she's had so much loss in her life, whereas Marjorie has a very difficult life but hasn't experienced the same loss. The way she thinks and deals with her children is very different. Essentially, I suppose it's the showings or the visions that they have that link them. When I was reading it, I thought this was just a lovely way to finally understand what the two women kind of had in common. Were you aware of their differences as you were writing it?
Oh, very much so. So one of the things that I really enjoyed writing it was drawing out the contrasts. So, I used to write poetry, and so for Julian, I've really drawn on poetic techniques. I've used a lot of metaphor. I've used a lot of lyrical language. I've used sort of observations of the natural world. So I really kind of let my inner lyric poet go with Julian's voice. And so I really enjoyed the contrast of Marjorie, who's very direct. She never observes anything. She's far too busy, being confused about herself and her own life. And so once I'd written a draft of it, one of the things that was really fun was working out where to break these monologues, because they're very interwoven. And so I tried sometimes to create moments where you can see similarities between them. Sometimes you can see how different they are. Sometimes I've tried to create sort of poignancy. Sometimes I've tried to just go for humour, basically, where you go from the peace of Julian's cell and contemplating the hazel nut and the hazel tree growing, straight into kind of Marjorie's kind of extremeness and kind of over the top voice. So it was really fun I was very conscious of the differences right from the start. It was really fun to play with that.
And I think there's a lot of humour in the book. When I started reading it, I wasn't expecting to kind of laugh out loud at points, particularly with Marjorie, her crying. I adored. I feel like I was really rooting for Marjorie by the end, and I'm sure she's not an easy person to live with. But what a character. I think we have to kind of move on and talk about religion. It can really underpin the book, and it underpins the society in which they live. How did you approach this in the novel? Was this an easy thing to kind of capture, or something you had to battle with to get the balance right?
For me, it wasn't a battle. I was very conscious that at this time it's pre-Reformation, so people would have been Catholic essentially by default. There was starting to be the beginnings of Reformation thought. There had been a translation of the Bible into English, and people were being burnt as heretics for questioning certain things, questioning whether a priest was needed to intercede between a person and God, questioning some of the other practices of the Catholic Church. But it was, for most people at this time, Catholicism was simply an unquestioned part of their worldview. So I was really conscious that needed to be inbuilt into these women. I wanted to take them on their own terms, and I wanted to be very empathetic about their religious outlook as well. And in terms of the visions, I mean, it's fascinating to read Julian's visions of Christ. So she has this fever and she has these 16 showings, as she calls them, and they're unbelievable to read in Revelations of Divine Love. They're so visceral, they're so vivid. She sees Christ dying on the cross in front of her, and it's so bodily. He's absolutely a human man suffering in front of her. His skin is desiccating. She sees into the wound where the spear's gone in, and it's horrendous, absolutely horrendous. And she says how she had wished for some kind of suffering before this happens, so that she could feel closer to God. But now that she has an inkling of what Jesus went through, she can't believe she ever wished such suffering upon herself. And it's so moving. And so I really try to kind of bring that physicality of Julian's showings onto the page, and to incorporate some of the language she uses. And so that's a really important part of Julian's faith, I think, that kind of physical suffering of Jesus. So yeah, and I didn't find that difficult to write about. I found that really just satisfying, I suppose, as a writer, to bring in that physicality. With Marjorie's visions, she has been sort of treated more dismissively, I suppose, by theologians in the past. Sort of a postpartum psychosis is often used to explain away the visions, and it was really important to me that I didn't give an explanation, that I've left it open. I tried to leave it open and to take Marjorie on her own terms as well. Her visions of Jesus are very different from Julian's, and they are very physical, but Jesus seems to just come and visit her and have conversations on this sort of semi-regular basis. He's like a pal who drops in to see her when she needs him. And she also talks about having intimacy with Jesus, and it seems to be almost sort of these sexual ecstasies that she experiences, which is very different from Julian's visions, as you can imagine. So yes, like, the book is theological, but what I liked about their theology was the physicality of it. And the other thing that Marjorie does is imagine herself in the Bible stories. So she imagines that she's at Jesus's birth. She's there at Bethlehem, trying to get somewhere for Mary to give birth. She swaddles the baby Jesus, and she makes all these stories feel incredibly real. Like, these are just people she knows. She's at Jesus's death as well, and she comforts Mary. She makes her a hot spice drink afterwards, and tries to comfort the Virgin Mary on the death of her son. And I really love this. And later, doing more research, I found that this wasn't incredibly unusual in the medieval period. It's called affective piety, and people were encouraged to imagine themselves as part of the Bible stories. I suppose, because people were illiterate, it was just a way of learning and a way of understanding, like, the Bible stories. No, it's fascinating.
And I suppose, as an extension of that, I mean, religion is weaved through everyone's lives at that period of time. And how did you feel about doing research of not just the fact both women are, their lives are dictated by religion? They get comfort, but they also obviously can be very easily persecuted, particularly by the men in society. So, as I was reading it, you can kind of recognise parallels with the society of today. How did you I'm assuming you were conscious of that when you were writing the novel, and how did you approach it?
Yeah, so in my mind, I suppose I divided the empathy that I wanted to create for the religious beliefs and the religious outlook. I divided that from how I wanted to tackle the church as an institution. And I definitely tried to create very pointed encounters between these women and their priests, their confessors, where they're not getting sympathy. And worse, they're getting threats, especially Marjorie. And just a kind of just general misogyny as well. And at one point, Marjorie says to her priest that she wants to talk to him for a couple of hours about Jesus and her visions. And the priest says, and Marjorie says this in her book, it's not mine making up, sort of basically, well, what could a woman possibly have to say, for so long? Like, bless my soul, how could you speak for so long? And people laughed at her and said, well, why would Jesus speak to you? You're a woman. So, it was very much that they were treated as second-class citizens within the church. And even in the short extract I read at the beginning, after Marjorie's given birth, she's not allowed to go to church for some time because women who've given birth are unclean. And one of the sins later that she confesses is going to church in an unclean time. It's not clear, I don't think, whether that's because she's given birth or because she's on her period. But, women are not holy. And, it was a lot of doubt about whether or not these women had visions. Well, Marjorie, because she's the one who really spoke about them, they were not, you're a woman, God wouldn't speak to you, was basically the attitude. And then with Marjorie, things just get worse and worse, and she's arrested. There's a threat of sexual violence towards her, which is, pretty horrendous. And it's only by pleading that she's a wife and therefore belongs to another man that she's able to free herself. So she has to sort of use the patriarchy against the patriarchy to save herself there. But the church is controlling and is just absolutely dismissive of Marjorie's claims.
And relies so heavily on fear as well.
Yeah.
And men very much are dictating the sins that the women are capable of having. And I think that's really powerful when it comes across. And I think what I find really clever about the book is that Marjorie and Julian are so, because of the constraints of the period time they live in, they are so attuned to what choices they actually have available. And I think when you get towards the end, or towards the end of the novel, you realise decisions they've made and connections they have. And it just feels quite profound, Again, when we're going to get towards the end part when we actually do meet, but did you have a clear idea of where you were going as you were writing the novel?
I knew that I wanted, writing's so messy. At some point, I knew that I wanted to make the meeting of them the climax, the end of the novel. I was frustrated that I couldn't. I wanted to write about what happened to Marjorie afterwards, because she goes on to live for another sort of 20 or so years. She inherits from her father and she's able to go on all these incredible pilgrimages around Europe. But because of the way that I'd started the novel, it would have completely unbalanced it, because Julian is about 30 years older. And so it would have gone from being a novel about these two women to a novel about Marjorie Kemp. And I decided that for the things that mattered to me, I needed to tie up the novel just quite soon after the meeting and make that the end. And in terms of the impulse, the early impulses, I was really excited to imagine this conversation between them. And that's part of why I've formatted it as I have as well. So once you get to the meeting, it kind of goes into script format, because I just wanted to pare away everything apart from the voices of these two women. They spoke through the window of Julian's cell, and there was probably a curtain between them, so they couldn't even look upon each other. So all they had was their voices. And so I decided all the reader would have is their voices. I've added one or two little sound effects where you might hear a shout from the street, almost like stage directions, because they would have heard those too. But in my mind, I was sort of imagining it almost as a play, with a kind of spotlight on each woman and a black curtain between them. And I just wanted to give every bit of attention to the words that those two women spoke to each other.
And I think that comes across really, really well. I want to touch on the title before I ask you to do it when we're reading. The title comes from Marjorie, and it's just before she's about to have a visit with Julian. And she's obviously at her lowest. It's her visions are really kind of detrimental to her mental health. She doesn't know, are these real, or if she is, or if it's the devil inside her. And so I thought, could you maybe talk us through the title, why the book's called what it is?
Yeah, sure. So the title was working on a few levels for me. Firstly, it's just a phrase of Marjorie's, and I was going to use it as an epigraph. But as a title, I just thought this doesn't sound like anything else. And that seems to be general consensus as well. So I liked that about it. I thought, okay, this is something that's really striking. There's 600 years between us and these two women, and in the language that I use, I didn't want a kind of cod Middle English these and nows, but there is, I hope, a strangeness to my language, to the syntax, to the tone, that just gives the nod to the fact that this is 600 years ago. And I feel like the title does that too. It's, it doesn't sound contemporary. But in terms of the meaning of it, Marjorie says to Jesus, and she's at this really low ebb, she's having these visions. She doesn't know why. She doesn't know if she can trust that they're holy visions. She's always afraid that her neighbours are right, that they're from the devil, that she's been made a fool of. So she says to Jesus, you who basically suffered so much, I'm asking you to give mercy to me, who hasn't suffered as much. And that's such a strange counterintuitive plea. But I feel that for me, that really sums up the idea of grace. It's unmerited favour from God. It's God's forgiveness that we haven't earned as sinners, but that is still just given. And I love the idea of grace. And for me, Julian's theology is really summed up by grace. She says, she looks back on her visions and she's worried about sin all the time. And then she thinks, I didn't see sin there. Sin is nothing. And I really was struck by that, the love and humaneness of that theology. So yeah, for me, this very strange, odd phrase, it really speaks about the idea of grace.
And very much true, of Gillian and the wisdom that she can impart on Marjorie.
Would you be happy to do one more final reading? Absolutely. So again, I'm going to start with Julian. So this is early on in her Anchoress days. From my window, I can see a hazel tree in the churchyard, the brick wall of a warehouse across the street, and a patch of sky beyond. Although I can no longer see the city, I can remember what's out there well enough. In my mind, I follow King Street down to the River Wensum, where there are ships of all sizes, bringing goods and merchants and pilgrims and news and ideas. As a child, I walked past the docks on my daily walk. I saw barrels of salted herring and boxes full of seeds and spices and cobweb fine Flemish lace. I saw brightly coloured birds that twittered, and once a white bear. It was taller than a man, and its great paws thrashed at its wooden cage, sending splinters flying. My nurse Joan always tried to drag me away, but I used to stare until my eyes ached. When I returned home, I could remember much of what I had seen and enjoy it all again, as if it was there before me. Now, when I cannot leave my cell, this practice serves me well. I conjure in my mind the sights and sounds and smells I have not experienced in many years. I admit that sometimes I think I would like to see the water slapping at the wooden planks of the dock, or the tarred hulls of the largest ships, sails flapping with impatience for the next voyage. When I smell the scent of adventure that comes off the seafaring folk as they pass my window, a strange feeling enters me, like grief or loss. I have an alms box by my window, and visitors usually drop in a few coins in exchange for my counsel and prayers. Local women bring loaves and bags of windfall pears and firkins of new ale. At first, Sarah, she had a maid in the next room who took care of her past her food cell. At first, Sarah took offence at such gifts, as if they were a criticism of her skills. But I said we should be grateful that the people think of us. Sarah sneers at some of my visitors, telling me that they sit there picking lice off themselves while they talk to me, or that they wipe their noses on their sleeves, or scratch their behinds. I try not to laugh, but offer gentle words to her about the need for compassion. None of us live as angels. Marjorie. Soon after my marriage, a travelling preacher told me that I was a sinner and must repent, that I must scourge my soul through mortification and penance, else God would show me no mercy. The preacher was talking to a group of people gathered around him, but as he spoke these words, he looked directly at me, and I knew he meant his words for me alone, that he could see all the sin in my heart rotting me on the inside. Although I tried to be good, somehow sin always overpowered me. I thought unkind thoughts about my brother, even after I was married and saw him less, and I took pride in wearing the most fashionable clothes. Over my hair shirt, I still wore my favourite cloaks, with slashes to show the bright colours of my silk robes underneath. I was also argumentative with John, because whenever my husband suggested I leave off my proud ways, I would answer him that I was from a worthy family, and if he did not like my ways, he should never have married me. I also went to church during my unclean times, and sometimes I even had lustful thoughts about my husband. These sins weighed heavily on me, and I feared everyone could see my weakness. When Christ came to me the first time, it was just a brief visit, but later he visited me many times, sometimes at church and sometimes in my bedchamber, and we talked for hours. He said to me, "When you are in bed, you may boldly take me to you as your wedded husband. You can take me in the arms of your soul and kiss my mouth, my head and feet as sweetly as you want." He took my hand, and I tried to hide the scar where I had bitten myself after the birth of my first child, but he kissed the mark and said I did not need to feel shame in front of him. When I told my husband what Jesus had said, he said that if he ever found me in bed with another man, he'd cut off my nose, and that I should keep quiet about these so-called visions, because nobody likes a liar.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the audience? I have many more, but it'd be lovely to hear from some of you.
Yeah, I've got a question from the online audience.
Yeah.
From Karen. Could you say a little bit about the language and the style in the book? There's a clarity and immediacy, and Karen was wondering if that was like a choice, how you made the choices about the language and the style.
Do you want me to repeat that? So,
Yes, please, that would be great.
So I think Karen's asking you to talk about the language of the book and the immediacy of the way it's said. I think that was it.
I think one of the things that I was very conscious about writing was to make it a novel that felt very tangible. And I hoped that that kind of physical immediacy would make it something that modern readers would feel less alien about. And even though it's a novel that explores quite a few kind of big topics, including sort of theology and the position of women, I try to avoid very much abstract language, and to keep everything very grounded. And I think that was not difficult to do because of the way that both women write about their visions in their books. But when I started to do some sort of social history research as well, and I really enjoyed thinking about, the kinds of things that people ate, the clothes that they wore, the things that they would have heard. So, for example, they didn't have clocks. Everything was very much about when the bells rang. But during the plague, so many people died. Bell ringers died. And so at the beginning, Julia remembers being a child and how even the bells felt silent. So I tried to show the kind of the bigger picture through the small concrete details. And I do use just a little dash of vocabulary. I'm not a medievalist, so I did read these books in translation in modern English, but I use a few words from the period. So I use peas cods, which is a kind of medieval snack they sell on the street. I refer to someone spilling wine on her kirtle, which is a robe. But I just wanted to just drop those in now and then, just to kind of, hint at the period without labouring it. And I was, when you're writing historical and you do research, you're always battling with yourself to kind of keep the research light. You know, you find out these like amazing things and you just really want them to be in there and they just won't fit. And you just know that someone's going to read it and think, oh, her research is showing there. As I
Very
really,
indulgent.
yeah, really like battled with myself to kind of always keep it through thinking about what did these women see. You know, so you know, with Julian, I do allow her to have memories of Norwich, and I enjoyed showing that Norwich was like a multicultural place, very dynamic. It was the second city of England at this time. So I talk about how, you know, the merchants are bringing the spices and bringing the ideas, and she hears all these languages. But I've tried to kind of show that that's something that Julian herself would have perceived, rather than imposing what I, as a novelist, find interesting about the period.
Hi. So first of all, thank you for taking the time to come tonight. It's been fantastic. I have two questions, and it's okay if there's not time for both of them. I think my first one, pressing one, is this is such a kind of, you speak about it with such an enjoyment, but also an intensity about doing the research and getting to know these two women as people and characters. I think my question is, when like looking back into the past and all this kind of situation, how did you not get swallowed up by it, and like kind of the intensity of what they were talking about, but also the people that they were, and you know, as like advice of like not getting stuck in the past, but also appreciating enough of it to continue writing about it.
I'll just repeat that for a minute. So how did you avoid not getting swallowed up in the research and the feel as you kind of immerse yourself in the novel?
Well, I'll answer that in a slightly roundabout way, but I am answering your question. Before I wrote For Thy Great Pain, I've been working for some years on a novel about John Ruskin, who, bless him, wrote more than 200 books and pamphlets himself. There are many dozens of biographies. There are probably thousands of books and articles about him. And yeah, I got swallowed, completely swallowed. And so that book, how I struggled with that one, because Ruskin is this incredible polymath, and I just wanted to put everything in. He was a botanist, he was a geologist, he was an artist, he was a teacher, he was a socialist, he was an environmentalist. He was a man of such incredible ideas and had such incredible thinking about things that still matter to us so much. And I was so desperate to tell the readers all about it, and I just couldn't get my manuscript to work as a novel. And so I needed a break from that, because I've been working on it for like 5 or 6 years and just couldn't get it right. So I wrote For Thy Great Pain during 2020, during lockdown, when none of us had a social life. And I wasn't a medievalist. I'd never studied the period before. I did a bit of research before I started. I mean, I had to read their works to start with, and I had to do a bit of scoping of like, what do we know about their biography? What do we know about how women lived at the time? But secretly, I didn't do loads of research. I wrote it, and then I would go back and check things. So, okay, I've got this reference to like Marjorie having a blister the size of a gooseberry. And then I was like, did they even have gooseberries? And so I would like go back and check and really try to make sure that I hadn't got things wrong. And I got plenty of things wrong, but that was fine, because you can tweak them in the editing and you can take things out. I had Julian knitting. Turns out they didn't knit in the 15th century in England. They knitted in other parts of the world. I think China and Africa have knitting. England doesn't yet. So that had to go, and it had to be embroidery. So just, things like that I did have to change. But I think that not doing, 4 years of research before I sat down to write the manuscript was basically the secret. And it just meant that I had that enough imaginative freedom, along with the research that I had done, to kind of feel that these were my characters. I could take ownership of them. And I'm not presenting the novel as a kind of authoritative version of Marjorie Kemp or Julian of Norwich at all. So yeah, keeping my research to a minimum is a terrible thing to say. Great question. The question is, how did the writing residencies that you've undertaken influence your writing? I think that when thinking about Julie as an anchoress, I definitely draw my experience of writing residency. So I've done some in quite remote places, and I spent 2 months in a wood in Finland in 2019, quite soon before I started writing the novel. Actually, I did a little bit of research on Julian while I was there, just online and so on. So I was very much already had the novel as a seed while I was there, and just the way that time plays out. Sometimes residencies are amazing. I've been on residencies where I've been so productive, written loads, read loads, been really stimulated. And then I've been on residencies and you just can't always know how they're going to go, where I felt quite stuck. I've been very aware of time passing in a very slow way. I've been very aware of just sitting there in my own body. And so, yes, even obviously the book isn't autobiographical, but as a writer, you always draw on your own experiences, and the things that you think about and the way that you think about things have undoubtedly, affected how I've drawn Julian and Marjorie. And yeah, I've spent a lot of time on my own. I sometimes, joke that later in life I might become a nun. It is a joke, okay? My mum's probably watching, it's a joke, mum. But I sort of feel like I can, as a writer, what's brilliant is you can imagine it without having to do it. You can really, bed down in an experience and live other lives, and as a writer, and that's like one of the things I love about reading and writing. I suppose the other thing that I was drawing on was it was lockdown, and time became very different for nearly everybody. I live in a village that is quiet anyway, and wow, it became quiet. There was just no traffic ever passed, and clock time didn't matter so much because there was nothing happening at 8 o'clock. So it became much more conscious of what was going on outside my window, in the garden, the natural world, how the seasons were passing. That idea that I've already mentioned about there were, the bells not ringing, that silence that descended was very profound. I know everyone had different experiences of lockdown, but for me it was a time of enormous quietness. And so, yeah, that also I think informed how I wrote about Julian. And just looking at it there, just some of the things I wrote about how she's frustrated, how she's just still herself. She expected to be different, and she's just still there with all her racing thoughts. I remember sitting at my desk thinking, my mind just won't shut up. It was a time of such heightened anxiety, just desperate doom scrolling. And so I think those sorts of very powerful, difficult emotions that I went through, and that I know a lot of other people went through, definitely informed it. Yeah.
Okay, I've taken one more question if anyone has one.
Margie's husband. No, do you need to repeat it?
No, I just think you're going to elaborate on Margie.
Yeah, so Marjorie's husband. Yeah, John, poor old John. He comes across in really conflicted ways in the book. She is very positive about him in some ways, and he comes across as quite a tolerant, gentle man at times. And they did have a very loving and physical relationship at times, because one of the sins she thinks about is how much she enjoyed her husband's body when they were young. And yet later, she asks him for a chaste marriage and says she doesn't want to have sex anymore, and she wishes she was still a virgin. And she worries that she won't get to be at Jesus's side in heaven because she's not a virgin. And this really bothers her. And she asks Jesus to make her husband leave her alone, which, according to Marjorie, he does. And she asks her husband, you've not approached me sexually for ages. Why is that? And she's pleased about it, but curious. And he says, every time I come near you, I feel afraid. And Marjorie thinks that this is Jesus is doing. And she's very happy about that. So there's this sort of like, she's enjoyed his body and then she wants a chaste relationship. It's not in my book, but towards the end of their life together, he falls down the stairs and is incapacitated. He needs 24-hour care, essentially. And at this point, they no longer live together because they have had this chaste relationship. And she wants the world, of course, she wants everyone to know it's chaste. So they live separately. But once her husband's ill, she moves back in with him again to take care of him. And she says that it's only right that she does this because she enjoyed his body when she was young. So there is still that tenderness there between them. Sometimes, there's that kind of misogyny of the time where he doesn't take her vision seriously. He finds her very annoying. She, doesn't know her place enough. So there is always that aspect of it. But I think in some ways I have a lot of sympathy with John as well. He is often very patient and kind with her. And Marjorie, I think, I'm very much team Marjorie. I love her. I think she's a fantastic woman, but also probably very difficult to be around. So I think I have a soft spot for John. Yeah.
I'm still team Marjorie.
Yes, yeah.
Unfortunately, I think we have to draw it to a close. We've reached 8 o'clock. I'm hoping, I think Vicky is going to sign books. So if you haven't bought one already, please do and get it signed. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming and joining us. And thank you very much, Vicky, for
It was your pleasure. Thank you all for coming. It's been lovely. Thank you. Thank you, Michelle, very much. Her novel, The Pharmacist, is just out in paperback, and it's wonderful.